Hello everybody, welcome to Module 2 of Wildland Wilderness Training. Excited to get started, so here we go. On Module 1, we talked about brief overviews of what this training entails and how you go about planning a wilderness trip from what we were calling the dream states and on through to actually getting to the trailhead. And that was a high-level overview that hopefully will prime everybody for the information that we'll start taking a deep dive into right now. This particular module is our route and logistics planning module. Right away, what we have here is we're going to be starting off looking at the types of environments that we'll be running groups, types of environments we'll be exploring, terrain considerations, camping reservations, that goes along with permitting, etc., vehicle and trailhead strategy, moving efficiently and safely with groups, and then we're going to be taking a really deep dive into e-scouting and what I call boots on the ground scouting. Starting off with our types of environments, each of these types of areas will necessitate a little bit of custom planning when it comes to the trips that we're running. Like we talked about in the previous module, sometimes the location is going to be dictated by where we, the expedition leader, wants to go. More often than not, especially in a commercial sense, in a guiding sense, oftentimes what you have are groups of clients, participants who want to head out in a particular area. For each type of environment, there are some considerations when it comes to our planning. And then, of course, there's some considerations with our group management while we're there. Let's start off with the planning side of it. In the western US, we have some incredible mountains, passes, peaks. And so we're talking a little bit more about some rugged terrain, lots of elevation gain and loss, potentially steep, exposed trails and areas, and then higher elevation. Desert environments tend to not necessarily have high peaks to navigate off of, but we'll be navigating off of how many tributaries are coming off of that main wash, canyons that we're passing, that sort of thing. As far as vegetation goes, seems like an odd consideration, but that'll determine how far you can see in that environment. Are you able to navigate off of peaks if you're surrounded by forests? Are you able to bushwhack through that vegetation? If you're doing e-scouting, and we'll get to this in a little bit, is that slope actually open that you're hoping to go off trail through? Or is that head-high scrub oak that will be next to impossible, if not really frustrating, to hike through? Depending on what location you'll be exploring, considering weather patterns and especially the seasons and time of year is going to be vital. That goes without saying, but typically what my year looks like is in the winter, I'll typically be in the mountains because that's snow and ice season. Trips change a little bit. They're not so much backcountry or backcountry living, but more day trips, maybe yurt type trips. In the spring, of course, is desert season. It's a really good time to be in the desert. In the mountains, snow is melting out that time of year and it can be really hard travel. Springtime can be a sensitive time if you're in the wintering grounds of certain animals because they're either having their young or they're weak from a long winter, and we don't want to be pressuring those animals. The mountains can also be just muddy, have a lot of melting out snow and avalanche debris to navigate. So consider that. Springtime in the desert is a wonderful time to be there. As things warm up and dry out, going up in elevation is a really good idea. So summertime, I typically spend a lot of time higher elevations in the mountains, and the desert is just frankly too hot The month of June can be manageable, but getting into July and August, being in the desert's just really hard, and water's a big consideration, and people's comfort and hydration. You almost have to be a desert creature and do all your activities early morning, later in the evening, and then siesta in the middle of the day. So that can throw a wrench into lots of different itineraries. Fall time is a great time to be in both the desert and the mountains. You get the colors changing up high. You have incredible weather in the desert. Fall time could be anybody's guess if there's water there. Springtime, typically you'll find more water sources. Springs most likely will be running, and potholes in the canyons will definitely be full. But you might have to contend with walking through water in the spring down deep in those canyons. So it's always a trade-off. Also, with our environments and the locations that we're going to choose to go, we talked a little bit about our charismatic megafauna, two species of animals that I would really take into consideration when it comes to sensitive times of the year or risk management would be grizzly bear and the presence of moose. Grizzly bear, no brainer. There are areas in the US, in the western US, that have large populations. You can do your homework and figure out what's the density of the grizzly population, as well as if there have been historically any problems with those grizzly bear. It's not a reason to not go, but it's a reason to take certain precautions. And certainly a solo trip versus a trip with a group is going to be a way different animal. Solo trips, I would say, take some large precautions and maybe avoid areas with grizzly bears. In groups, 3 or more, the likelihood of a negative grizzly bear encounter is going to diminish. As far as preparing for potential animal encounters, certainly bringing bear spray is prudent if you know you're going to be in bear country, and that goes for grizzly and black bear, and know how to use that bear spray. Even watch some videos. There's some stuff on YouTube of people spraying down targets, maybe even spraying animals themselves. Bear spray is not a bad idea for moose potentially, or other species like mountain lion. I know I've carried bear spray when I've been alone and in areas where I've seen mountain lion. But again, safety in numbers, and I think you won't have a problem with animal encounters. The biggest consideration for bear country is going to be planning ahead to either hang your food in camp or to carry bear canisters to put your food in. And I'm talking about every morsel of food goes into a bag that gets hung from a tree or stuffed in a bear-proof canister, and that lives where your kitchen is. Typically, the protocol is to have your kitchen and your food hung no less than 200 feet from camp, and you want that food and kitchen to be downwind from camp so you don't have food smells wafting through your camp and potentially have a bear following that scent through camp to get to your food. As far as our terrain considerations go, we've talked about whether we're planning in some off-trail hiking, if we're going to be sticking to a trail. Some of the less obvious things are things like Jeep roads and ATV roads that we might encounter for part of our route, and being sure that you're still navigating even on those roads, because it's very easy to switch your brain off and follow those roads blindly and head off on some fork, and suddenly you're nowhere near where you need to be. So you're still doing your navigating even though you're on an established road, let's say. Consider your route and what kind of exposure, and by that I mean exposure to height and fall potential, but also exposure to weather. Some of the tablelands in Utah and Colorado, you can find yourself up high and exposed, during afternoon thunderstorms, let's say, and if you don't have an escape route or you haven't planned your day in a way that gets you up and over a high pass or over those tablelands before storms arrive, you could be in some danger. Now, paying attention to weather and strategizing from there is going to be crucial. So that's what I mean by exposure too. With our terrain considerations, a really big one is going to be elevation gain and loss, and factoring that into our timing, our pacing, which we'll get to in a little bit, and the abilities of the group. It can be really hard on a group and really hard on the itinerary if you haven't factored in steep elevation gain and steep elevation loss. Consider the commitment you're getting into with your route planning. And by that I mean, if you're planning an out and back, so a point A to point A, and you're just going to be planning in to retrace your steps back out, it's not the most ambitious, but for a brand new group, that might be really cool to go to an objective and then you're coming back some familiar terrain. Now a loop, a point A to point A, but following a loop around back to the trailhead, those are really great as far as seeing a lot of country, and you're not particularly committed because you can always backtrack if you don't make it to your halfway point. Now a point A to point B, you're not always committed to getting to that point B. You can always backtrack to A, if that makes sense. But again, it's a little bit more logistically challenging, and you're short a vehicle and will have to do a shuttle of some sort. So consider that with how committed you are, and if something happens to one of the group members, how easy is it then? Is that person out of the commission and you need them to run a shuttle? So how realistic is that with your risk management? With commitment too, if you look at descending, let's say, a semi or a technical canyon, can you backtrack? You're pretty committed after that first rappel if you can't re-climb what you just rappelled. So that's full commitment. Not to mention when we get into flash flood danger, once you're in that canyon, how expeditiously can you get out of that canyon if something happens? So backtracking might not at all be an option. How much of the sky can you see? How reliable is that forecast? Because you might have flash flood danger if there's rain going on anywhere upstream and you're committed to that canyon. That takes a lot of forethought and self-awareness to imagine how quickly you might realistically be able to get your group or get yourselves in and then out of that canyon. Avalanche hazard, rock fall is another big one. What kind of exposure does that trail have to hang fire coming down from up high? Are you passing through a rocky gully that's particularly loose or steep and snow covered? What time of year is it? What sort of weather patterns have been going on? Typically spring is a more dangerous time for rockfall when everything's kind of freezing and thawing, expanding and contracting. So you'll get a lot more activity in the mountains at that time. Certainly the desert as well. After big rain events, massive sandstone formations have collapsed. How exposed are you and your group to those sorts of features and those sorts of kind of terrain traps, you could say? Are you going to be in the bottom of a steep valley with lots of potential rockfall and avalanche hazard around you? Depending on your itinerary, you might have a day prior to going into the backcountry. You might have a day after you come out of the backcountry planned, whether that's camping. Hotels are really nice when you come out of the backcountry for showers and whatnot. But planning in what sort of camping you can do adjacent to the trailhead. And you might just be planning a full-blown front country or semi-front country base camp the entire trip and running day trips out of there. I do that a lot, and it's pretty nice to have a comfortable base camp to come back to. Many areas will have just dispersed camping, and that'll be just first come, first serve. You typically will roll up, find an area, hopefully that's already impacted with a fire ring, etc. Those places are pretty common. And utilize those places. Don't create new camping areas. Even if it's full, even if something looks particularly comfortable, we want to try and use already impacted areas. So that'll be your dispersed camping. However, be aware that they're going to be primitive as far as not having bathroom facilities, hygiene facilities, that sort of thing. So plan accordingly. And then, of course, you will have your established campgrounds. Sometimes they're first come, first serve. Sometimes they are reservable 4 to 6 months out. And a good resource to check if you can reserve those types of campsites, even group sites, will be resources like recreation.gov, sometimes on the land manager's website, whether it's Forest Service or BLM, will have links to kind of concessioners like recreation.gov that handle their reservations. But it really pays to be on the ball. And again, going back to our dream state and our trip planning, as soon as you catch an inkling that you might be running a trip in a particular area and might need a campsite, that's going to be number one. Go reserve that. You can get a refund. Once you have your campsite reserved, figure out how long it's going to take to get, let's say, from an airport to that campsite and from that campsite to the trailhead. Factor all those things in, and it really helps to have that campsite, kind of that staging area, let's call it, to get ready, to get your gear ready. It helps to have that close to the trailhead so you can maximize the time on the trail in the backcountry. Do you need a shuttle vehicle? Or is it just peace of mind having a second vehicle in case you have some hiccups along the road, flat tires, engine problems, a vehicle gets stuck, you name it? Having some redundancy when it comes to those things is really nice. Will it be handy to have a water or food cache? If you're leaving food as a cache, remember our animal protocol. Have hard shell plastic bins, hang that food, but keeping it away from critters because A, we don't want to be feeding critters, B, those critters leave wrappers, food particles, everything all over the environments we're exploring, and then C, last but not least, to be hungry and out of food and then show up at your cache only to have a big mess to clean up and no food. Hide your water if you're going to cache it. Hide your food as best as possible. I hate to say it, but people can and do mess with that sort of thing. So again, if your safety is reliant on accessing that water and food, you really want to make sure it's there when you go to retrieve it. Even in our pre-planning stage, we can factor in moving efficiently and safely with a group and how we do those things. Depending on our group size, we might want to split in half. Some trails, some land managers, some permits will require groups to be no larger than 8. I've seen 12. I've seen no larger than 14 people. Having smaller groups that we're traveling with is really nice in terms of people having a more intimate experience with the environment, with their group. It's also less impact on other visitors, less impact on the trail. So you might have to plan in that. What are some strategies you're going to use to ensure that if there's a fork in the trail, that that person ahead or that group ahead doesn't go left and you go right? Staying found can happen well before you even get to the trailhead. And that's just a matter of taking a look at maps with the leadership team. Where are we going? What are some landmarks to look for? What are some forks in the trail that we should pay attention to? That sort of thing. And then use your participants too. Orient everyone to where we're going, to what's on the map at the trailhead. point out those features, point out those forks in the road, point out some places where navigation might be difficult. As far as pacing goes, that can also ensure that the group stays together, but also that the group stays comfortable and is operating well within their abilities. I leave camp with an all-day pace, and going smooth and efficiently is going to be far better in the long run than charging quickly. Have a travel plan. We're going to walk for 50 minutes, break for 10. Walk for another 50 minutes, break for 10. And while we're talking about pacing, are we always as fast as our slowest person? And this is something that's come up a lot in my career, and that is, it's very hard to push someone faster than they're comfortable or able to go. And then there's always the group members that feel like they haven't pushed themselves or they haven't met some physical goal or objective. And so how do you square those things? And a couple strategies that I've employed is, again, really good pacing from the outset. If you're moving really quickly, that person who's struggling to keep up is going to get in their heads, and they're not going to get any quicker. They're only going to get slower. And injury and frustration could ensue. So start off with a moderate pace, and then we can always increase the pace from there as people get comfortable and packs get lighter. When it comes to people that really want to charge and they're not feeling like they're particularly challenged, maybe they take a bit more in their packs, maybe they take on a little bit more leadership or route finding, those sorts of things. And sometimes we can really try and stack the odds in the favor of the person who's going slower. Like, hey, we're going to challenge you by moving at this pace, especially on days where there's not a lot of elevation gain or loss, that sort of thing. And then for whatever objectives or programming you're planning on doing with your group, does small group travel or even solos make sense? Those are usually reserved for groups with more experience, or if you have a really long trip, a long itinerary, and you're able to give groups the tools to accomplish those things without taking on excessive risk, that's fantastic.